Hello, and welcome to Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. These are little blue books, as you can see by the title at the top of it. This one happens to be number 813, Contemporary American Philosophers, Santayana, James, and Dewey, written by Will Durant, Ph.D. And I think this is part 4. Don't quote me on that. It'll be, in the title. We left off on page 38. Pragmatism, chapter 2. And I think this is on James. The direction of his thought is always to things. And if he begins with psychology, it is not as a metaphysician who loves to lose himself in ethereal obscurities, but as a realist to whom thought, however distinct it may be from matter, is essentially a mirror of external and physical reality. And it is a better mirror than some have believed. It perceives and reflects not merely separate things as Hume supposed, but their relations too. It sees everything in a context, and the context is immediately given in perception as the shape and touch and odor of the thing. Hence the meaninglessness of Kant's problem of knowledge. How we put sense and order into our sensations, the sense and the order, in outline at least, are already there. The old automatistic psychology of the English school, which conceived thought as a series of separate ideas mechanically associated, is a misleading copy of physics and chemistry. Thought is not a series, it is a stream in which ideas are passing. There's a stream, a continuity of perception and feeling, in which ideas are passing nodules like corpuscles in the blood. We have mental states, though this is again a misleading static term, that correspond to prepositions, verbs, adverbs, and conjunctions, as well as states that reflect the nouns and pronouns of our speech. We have feelings of for and to and against and because and behind and after, as well as of matter and men. It is these transitive elements in the flow of thought that constitute the thread of our mental life and give us some measure of the continuity of things. Consciousness is not an entity, not a thing, but a flux and system of relations. It is a point at which the sequence and relationship of thoughts coincides illuminatingly with the sequence of events and the relationship of things. In such moments, it is reality itself, and no mere phenomenon, that flashes into thought. For beyond phenomena and appearance, there is nothing. Nor is there any need of going beyond the experience process to a soul. The soul is merely the sum of our mental life, as the noumenon is simply the total of all the phenomenon, and the absolute, the web of the relationships of the world. It is this same passion for the immediate and actual and real that led James to pragmatism. Brought up in the school of French clarity, he abominated the obscurities and pedantic terminology of German metaphysics, and when Harris and others began to import a moribund Hegelianism into America, James reacted like a quarantine officer who had detected an immigrant infection. He was convinced that both the terms and the problems of German metaphysics were unreal, and he cast about him for some test of meaning which would show to every candid mind the emptiness of these abstractions. He found the weapon which he sought when in 1878 he came upon an essay by Charles Peirce in the Popular Science Monthly on how to make our ideas clear. To find the meaning of an idea, said Peirce, we must examine the consequences to which it leads in action. Otherwise, dispute about it may be without end, and will surely be without fruit. This was a lead which James was glad to follow. He tried the problems and ideas of the old metaphysics by this test, and they fell to pieces at its touch, like chemical compounds suddenly shot through with a current of electricity. And such problems as had meaning took on a clearness and a reality as if, in Plato's famous figure, they had passed out of the shadows of a cave into the brilliance of a sunlit noon. This simple and old-fashioned test led James on to a new definition of truth. Truth had been conceived as an objective relation as once good and beauty had been. Now, what if truth, like these, were also relative to human judgment and human needs? Natural laws had been taken as objective, truths eternal and unchangeable. Spinoza had made them the very substance of his philosophy. And yet what were these truths but formulations of experience, convenient and successful in practice, not copies of an object, but correct calculations of specific consequences? Truth is the cash value of an idea. The true is only the expedient in the way of our thinking, just as the right is only the expedient in the way of our behaving. Expedient is almost any fashion, and expedient in the long run and on the whole, of course, for what meets expediently all the experiences in sight won't necessarily meet all further experiences equally satisfactorily. Truth is one species of good, and not, as is usually supposed, a category distinct from good, and coordinate with it. The true is the name of whatever proves itself to be good in the way of belief. Truth is a process and happens to be an idea. Verity is verification. Instead of asking whence an idea is derived or what are its premises, pragmatism examines its results. It shifts the emphasis and looks forward. It is the attitude of looking away from first things, principles, categories, supposed necessities, and of looking towards last things, fruits, consequences, facts. Scholasticism asked, "What is the thing?" and lost itself in quiddities. Darwinism asked, "What is its origin?" and lost itself in nebulous. Pragmatism asked, "What are its consequences?" and turns the face of thought to action and the future. Chapter 3. Pluralism. Let us apply this method to the oldest problem in philosophy, the existence and nature of God. The scholastic philosophers describe the deity as ens a se extra et supra omne genus necessarium unum infinite perfectum simplex immutable immension eternum intelligens. This is magnificent. Any deity would be proud of such a definition. But what does it mean? What are its consequences for mankind? If God is omniscient and omnipotent, we are puppets. There is nothing that we can do to change the course of destiny which His will has from the beginning delineated and decreed. Calvinism and fatalism are the logical controlees of such a definition. The same test applied to mechanistic determination issues in the same results. If we really believed in determinism, we would become Hindu mystics and abandon ourselves at once to the immense fatality which uses us as marionettes. Of course, we do not accept these somber philosophies. The human intellect repeatedly proposes them because of their logical simplicity and symmetry, but life ignores and overflows them. A philosophy may be unimpeachable in other respects, but either of two defects will be fatal in its universal adoption. First, its ultimate principle must not be one that essentially baffles and disappoints our dearest desires and most cherished hopes. But a second and worse defect in a philosophy than contradicting other active propensities is to give them no object whatever to press against. A philosophy whose principle is so incommensurate with our most intimate powers as to deny them all relevancy in universal affairs, as to annihilate their motives at one blow, will be even more unpopular than pessimism. That is why materialism will always fail of universal adoption. Men accept or reject philosophies, then according to their needs and their temperaments, not according to objective truth. They do not ask, is this logical? They ask, what will the actual practice of this philosophy mean for our lives and our interests? Arguments for and against may serve to illuminate, but they never prove. Logic and sermons never convince. The damp of the night drives deeper into my soul. Now I re-examine philosophies and religions. They may prove well in lecture rooms, yet not prove at all under the spacious clouds and along the landscape in flowing currents. We know that arguments are dictated by our needs, and that our needs cannot be dictated to by arguments. The history of philosophy is to a great extent that of a certain clash of human temperaments, of whatever temperament a professional philosopher is. He tries, when philosophizing, to sink the fact of his temperament. Temperament is no conventionally recognized reason, so he urges impersonal reasons only for his conclusions. Yet his temperament really gives him a stronger bias than any of his more strictly objective premises. These temperaments, which select and dictate philosophies, may be divided into the tender-minded and the tough-minded. The tender-minded temperament is religious. It likes to have definite and unchanging dogmas and a priori truths. It takes naturally to free will, idealism, monism, and optimism. The tough-minded temperament is materialistic, irreligious, implicit, going only on facts, sensationalistic, tracing all knowledge to sensation, fatalistic, pluralistic, pessimistic. Skeptical. In each group there are gaping contradictions, and no doubt there are temperaments that select their theories partly from one group and partly from the other. There are people, William James for example, who are tough-minded in their addiction to facts and in their reliance on the senses, and yet tender-minded in their horror of determinism and their need for religious belief. Can a philosophy be found that will harmonize these apparently contradictory demands? James believes that pluralistic theism affords us such a synthesis. He offers a finite God, not an Olympian thunderer sitting aloof on a cloud, but one helper, primus inter pares, in the midst of all the shapers of the great world's fate. The cosmos is not a closed and harmonious system. It is a battleground of cross currents and conflicting purposes. It shows itself with pathetic obviousness as not a uni but a multiverse. It is useless to say that this chaos in which we live, and more, is the result of one consistent will. It gives every sign of contradiction and division within itself. Perhaps the ancients were wiser than we, and polytheism may be truer than monotheism to the astonishing diversity of the world. Such polytheism has always been the real religion of common people, and is so still today. The people are right, and the philosophers are wrong. Monism is the natural disease of philosophers, who hunger and thirst not, as they think, for truth, but for unity. This world is one. The formula may become a sort of number worship, 3 and 7, have and have. It is true, been reckoned as sacred numbers, but abstractly taken, why is 1 more excellent than 43, or than 2,000,010? The value of a multiverse as compared with a universe lies in itself. That where there are cross currents and warring forces, our own strength and will may count and help decide the issue. It is a world where nothing is irrevocably settled, and all action matters. A monistic world is for us a dead world. In such a universe we carry out, willy-nilly, the parts assigned to us by an omnipotent deity, or a primeval nebula, and not all our tears can wipe out one word of the eternal script. In a finished universe, individuality is a delusion. In reality, the monist assures us, we are all bits of one mosaic substance. But in an unfinished world, we can write some lines of the parts we play, and our choices mold in some measure the future in which we have to live. In such a world we can be free. It is a world of chance and not of fate. Everything is not quite, and what we do may alter everything. If Cleopatra's nose, said Pascal, had been an inch longer or shorter, all history would have been changed. The theoretical evidence of such free will, or such a multiverse, or such a finite God, is as lacking as for the opposite philosophies. Even the practical evidence may vary from person to person. It is conceivable that some may find better results for their lives from a deterministic than from a libertarian philosophy. But where the evidence is inconclusive, our vital and moral interests should make the choice. If there be any life that it is really better that we should lead, and if there be any idea which if believed in would help us to lead that life, then it would be really better for us to believe in that idea, unless indeed belief in it incidentally clashed with other greater vital benefits. Now the persistence of the belief in God is the best proof of its almost universal vital and moral value. James was amazed and attracted by the endless varieties of religious experience and belief. He described them with an artist's sympathy, even where he most disagreed from them. He saw some truth in every one of them, and demanded an open mind toward every new hope. He did not hesitate to affiliate himself with the Society for Physical Research. Why should not such phenomena, as well as others, be the object of patient examination? In the end, James was convinced of the reality of another spiritual world. I finally disbelieve myself that our human experience is the highest form of experience extant in the universe. I believe rather that we stand in much the same relation to the whole of the universe as our canine and feline pets do to the whole of human life. They inhabit our drawing rooms and libraries. They take part in scenes of whose significance they have no inkling. They are merely tangent to curves of history, the beginnings and ends and forms of which pass wholly beyond their ken. So we are tangent to the wider life of things. Nevertheless, he did not think of philosophy as a meditation on death. No problems had value for him unless they could guide and stimulate our terrestrial career. It was with the excellencies, not the duration of our natures, that he occupied himself. He did not live in his study so much as in the current of life. He was an active worker in 100 efforts for human betterment. He was always helping somebody, lifting men up with the contagion of his courage. He believed that in every individual there were reserve energies, which the occasional midwifery of circumstance would bring forth. And his constant sermon to the individual and to society was a plea that these resources should be entirely used. He was horrified at the waste of human energy in war, and he suggested that these mighty impulses of combat and mastery could find a better outlet in a war against nature. Why should not every man, rich or poor, give 2 years of his life to the state, not for the purpose of killing other people, but to conquer the plagues and drain the marshes and irrigate the deserts and dig the canals and do the physical and social engineering which builds up so slowly and painfully, which war so quickly destroys? He sympathized with socialism, but he disliked its depreciation of the individual and the genius. Taine's formula, which reduced all cultural manifestations to race, environment, and time, was inadequate, precisely because it left out the individual. But only the individual has value. Everything else is a means, even philosophy. And so we need on the one hand a state which shall understand that it is the trustee and servant of the interest of individual men and women, and on the other a philosophy and a faith which shall offer the universe as an adventure rather than a scheme, and shall stimulate every energy by holding up the world as a place where, though there are many defeats, there are also victories waiting to be won. A shipwrecked sailor buried on this coast bids you set sail. Full may a gallant bark, when we were lost, weathered the gale. Chapter 4. Comment. The reader needs no guide to the new and the old elements of this philosophy. It is part of the modern war between science and religion. Another effort, like Kant's and Bergson's, to rescue faith from the universalized mechanics of materialism. Pragmatism has its roots in Kant's practical reason, in Schopenhauer's exaltation of the will, in Darwin's notion that the fittest, and therefore also the fittest and truest idea, is that which survives. Its utilitarianism, which measured all goods in terms of use, is the empirical and inductive transitions of English philosophy. And finally, in the suggestions of the American scene, Professor Dewey believes that this tichism, this conception of the world as the theater of chance and not of fate, reflected the unflinched character of the America of James' day. Certainly, as everyone has pointed out, the manner, if not the substance, of James' thinking was specifically and uniquely American. The American lust for the movement and acquisition fills the sails of his style and thought, and gives them a buoyant and almost aerial mobility. Huneker calls it a philosophy for Philistines, and indeed there is something that smacks of salesmanship in it. James talks of God as an article to be sold to a materialistically minded consumer by every device of optimistic advertising, and he counsels us to believe as if he were recommending long-term investments with high dividends, in which there was nothing to lose and all the world to win. It was America's defense reaction against European metaphysics and European science. The new test of truth was of course an ancient one, and the honest philosopher described pragmatism modestly as a new name for old ways of thinking. If the new test means that truth is that which has been tried by experience and experiment, the answer is, of course. If it means that personal utility is a test of truth, the answer is, of course not. Personal utility is merely personal utility. Only universal, permanent utility would constitute truth. When some pragmatist speaks of a belief having been true once because then useful, though now disproved, they utter nonsense. They utter nonsense learnedly. It was a useful error, not a truth. Pragmatism is correct only if it is a platitude. What James meant to do, however, was to dispel the cobwebs that had entangled philosophy. He wished to reiterate in a new and startling way the old English attitude towards theory and ideology. He was but carrying on the work of Bacon, in turning the face of philosophy once more towards the inescapable world of things. He will be remembered for his empirical emphasis, this new realism, rather than for his theory of truth, and he will be honored, perhaps, more as a psychologist than as a philosopher. He knew that he had found no solution for the old question. He frankly admitted that he had expressed only another guess, another faith. On his desk, when he died, there lay a paper on which he had written his last and perhaps his most characteristic sentence. There is no conclusion. What has concluded, that we might conclude in regard of it? There are no fortunes to be told, and there is no advice to be given. Farewell. And we'll stop there.